Hello, everybody. It's great to be back. Great to see you all. I hope you're all okay. We are back for part 11 now of Lockdown in Lockdown, their Escape from Furnace read-through. And I am here. I have tea this time, so hopefully it'll be a slightly better reading today. Although, of course, I can make no guarantees because I'm not a professional book reader. Alex is inside Furnace Penitentiary, obviously. He's having a pretty rubbish time in there. He is kind of getting close now to Donovan and Z. Another few kids have just arrived. One is called Toby, one is called Ashley, and one is called Gary Owens. And Gary has just shanked a few kids and broken the arm of Kevin Arnold, the leader of the Skulls. It's all getting pretty dicey down there. The other thing that's going on is that Alex has started to formulate just an idea of where he might look for an escape, and that plan involves one of the chipping halls that they carve out of the rock with their pickaxes. Most specifically, it involves room 2, and that is the title of the first chapter we are going to read today. Okay, I hope you're sitting comfortably, and I shall begin. Room 2. The thought of facing another evening locked down in our cells was almost unbearable, but a small part of me was relieved that there was a set of thick metal bars between us and Gary Owens. As soon as the siren blew, the black suits had come running, one knocking down Gary with the butt of his shotgun, and the rest hauling him and his victims through the vault door. After a couple of hours of restless pacing, I saw the massive portal swing open again, and a couple of guards escort Gary, bruised and bloody, to his cell, which fortunately was on the second level, a long drop from mine. Some time later, Kevin was dragged back out into the yard, his arm in a rough cast that was the same shade of pale grey as his face. As soon as he emerged, Furnace's long-suffering inmates began whistling and whooping through their cell doors, calling out insults with a vicious ferocity fuelled by years of abuse. Kevin made no effort to reclaim his air of menace. He let himself be dragged up the steps, never taking his wide eyes off the floor. Looking back, I almost felt sorry for him. Little did I know then that he had far worse coming to him than a few jeers. When all fell quiet in the yard, I tried again to get Donovan interested in escape. It was like trying to get a hippopotamus interested in ballet. "There's nowhere to go," he said for the umpteenth time. "There must be. There's no such thing as a prison with no way out. Furnace is a prison with no way out, you plank. I can find a way, I know it. There's nowhere to go." Around and around and around in circles. Shortly before lights out, he sat bolt upright in his bunk as if he meant to strangle me, his expression so incensed that it was scary. "What?" I asked, backing off towards the bars just in case he'd finally lost it. "Why are you so desperate to die?" was his reply. I tried to argue, but he cut me off. There's only ever been one escape attempt in Furnace, a couple of years ago. It was a kid a little like you, only cleverer, smarter. He spent months learning the way the prison worked, especially the elevator, you know? Nobody knows how he managed it, but somehow, during a lockdown, he got himself inside the air vents. He stayed in there for 5 days, while the guards and the dogs hunted him down. Then, when they brought in more black suits from the surface, he found his way onto the roof of the elevator and hitched a ride up. "He made it?" I asked, my heart pounding at the very thought of somebody getting out. Donovan smiled wickedly and shook his head. "Oh no, they found him. They caught him climbing into the vents of the Black Fort on the surface. He was so hungry and thirsty he'd gone delirious. He was singing to himself. Guess what happened to him?" "The hole?" I said, sighing. "He wasn't that lucky. The warden, damn his soul, he brought that kid back down to the yard and he tied him up good. Then he let 3 of his dogs loose." Donovan faltered, his mind somewhere terrible. "They treated him like a toy, tossing him back and forth like some teddy bear until he was limp and broken. Then they ate him." "You're kidding," I said, certain that he was making the story up to scare me. Ask anyone who's been here longer than 2 years. They never talk about it, but they all remember it. Scott was his name, Scott White. You want to end up the same way as him? Then you carry on talking about escape, kid. But don't say I didn't warn you. So the air vents, I went on, trying to forget everything I'd just heard. They're still there, right? Donovan collapsed down on his bunk with a cry of frustration. Warden sealed them off the week after White was killed, replaced the tunnels with pipes so narrow you couldn't fit your hand inside. Why do you think the air is so thin down here? We're all suffocating because of the last idiot to think of freedom. He said something else, but it was lost beneath the siren. With a snap, the lights cut off, and I felt my way across the tiny cell to my bunk. Stripping to my underwear, I crawled under the rough sheet and tried to ignore the brutal images that paraded past my open, sightless eyes. A kid like me, being chewed and dismembered by beasts with bloody breath, while the whole of Furness looked on. It was almost enough to make me forget about escape, to resign myself to a lifetime behind bars. Almost. Surely doing nothing was the worst kind of death imaginable. Endless days rotting in the guts of the earth, dying piece by piece by piece. As sleep blotted Scott White's violent end from my mind, I resolved to find out what lay in room 2, even if it cost me my life. As it turned out, I didn't have to wait too long. The next morning's work chart put Donovan and me back on chipping duty, giving me the perfect opportunity to scope out the abandoned cave. After a hearty bowl of gunk, we walked across the yard towards the crack in the wall, Donovan giving me concerned sideways glances practically every other step. I don't like that look you've got, he said as we reached the entrance to the chipping rooms. There was a black suit on duty, as always, his shotgun locked, loaded and aimed directly at our heads as we filed past. Donovan waited until we were out of earshot before continuing. Don't do anything stupid, okay? As if I would, I replied, beaming at him with a kind of wild-eyed insanity. He looked at me, open-mouthed, then shook his head and started selecting his equipment. I did the same, lifting a pick from the racks and slapping a hard hat onto my head. Switching on the lamp and pulling down the visor, I snatched a look across the hall at the entrance to room 2. It was sealed up with thick planks, but they were just wood. I gripped the pickaxe, wondering how quickly I could hack my way inside. Levels 1 to 3, room 1, bellowed the black suit, pointing his shotgun at the black hole on the other side of the room. Rest of you, get into room 3, now! We shuffled forwards with the same lack of enthusiasm we always did, and I let myself drift to the back of the crowd. The black suit was watching us go, his silver eyes never blinking, but I knew from experience that he wouldn't stand there all morning. Sooner or later he'd start patrolling the workrooms, and that was when I was going in. Once we'd passed through the cracked portal into room 3, I stationed myself as close to the door as possible. At this angle I could see back into the equipment room, where the long shadow of the guard sat heavy and motionless across the rock. After refusing once again to help me out, even by providing a distraction, Donovan swaggered over to the far end of the room and began hammering the rock. I added the sound of my pickaxe to the familiar percussion, but there was no strength to my swings. I was saving my energy for when it counted most. The snake-like shadow didn't budge for the better part of an hour, by which time my brow was dripping and my overalls were drenched, despite my lack of effort. The adrenaline shot that rocked my body when I saw the guard move almost made my legs buckle, but I embraced the boost. I checked the room to make sure nobody was watching, then edged my way towards the door. I could hear the black suit's footsteps growing fainter as he strode into the first chipping hall, but even when the sound had stopped, it took me a good few minutes to build up the nerve to peek around the corner. With a shuddering sigh, I saw the equipment room was empty, and I dashed across the stone floor to the wooden boards that sealed off room 2. There were 8 long planks in all, each fixed to the wall like a ladder. They didn't do a great job of concealing what lay beyond. Through the gaps I could see a tunnel stretching out into blackness, and my heart soared as once again I sensed the wind blowing through the cracks, the fresh air making me euphoric after the long days spent in Furness's stale passages. I breathed deeply, feeling like the sensation could lift me off the ground. Then I remembered what I was doing. I checked the entrance to the first room, but there was no sign of the black suit returning. I jammed the head of the pickaxe behind the plank closest to the ground, then leaned on the handle, using it as a lever. The bolts securing the plank to the stone didn't budge. Cursing, I tried the next board up, but it was equally stubborn. Taking another look in the direction the guard had walked, I steeled myself and swung my pickaxe at the wall. The sharp edge, struck the bottom set of bolts, sending a shower of sparks flying out into the room. Under normal circumstances, the noise would have been deafening, but it was easily lost against the backdrop of 100 pickaxes hammering against stone. I lifted the pick a second time and swung with every ounce of strength, gouging a hole in the rock where the bolt was secured. Wedging my tool back into the gap between the board and the floor, I pushed down again. This time the bolt held on with a little less conviction, then gave up and pinged out across the room, leaving one end of the plank flapping against the wall. I pulled hard, creating a gap that looked big enough for me to crawl through. Ramming my pickaxe into the nearest tool rack and slinging my helmet across the floor, I got down on my hands and knees and pushed my face into the hole. A blast of cool air slapped me, giving me strength, and I squeezed my left shoulder through the gap, ignoring the sting of sharp rock slicing into my skin. It was as I was pushing my other shoulder through that I heard the sound of footsteps, each louder than the last. I froze, peering through the gap to the entrance of room 1, and knowing that the black suit was returning, I had seconds at most, push in or pull out. I should have listened to my instincts, wrenched myself out of the hole and ran back to work, but I didn't. I forced my body forwards, gritting my teeth with the pain. The steps were getting louder, crunching against loose pieces of stone on the floor. My sleeve caught on the plank, hooking me in place, and I desperately tried to wrench it free. Crunch, crunch, crunch. No time. With a rip, my sleeve came free and I tumbled forwards. I pulled my feet in with the speed of a rabbit disappearing into a burrow, the board snapping back against the wall just as the black shadow swept across the room. The steps halted, and despite the endless hammering from the rooms next door, it felt like I'd been plunged into a pool of silence. As gently as I could, I rolled onto my back, then stood up, staring through the gaps in the makeshift door to see the black suit standing in the centre of the equipment room. His head was cocked, as if he was listening for something, but he wasn't looking in my direction. We remained like that for what seemed like an eternity, mirror images of each other's stillness. Finally, the guard straightened himself and paced towards the entrance to room 3. Eventually disappearing from sight. I breathed out as slowly and quietly as I could, then turned to see if this was truly my road to salvation. It was then that I realised my mistake. The tunnel that led into room 2 was darker than furnace at night. I had absolutely no way of seeing where I was going. I stood like an idiot for a couple of minutes, wondering what I'd expected. Lights along the walls and a red carpet? I cursed silently again, wishing I still had my helmet with its lamp. Then I began edging my way forwards. The lights from the equipment room sliced through the wooden planks to form faint stripes on the uneven floor, but the glow was powerless against the black heart of furnace, and by the time I'd taken a few steps, I was smothered by cold, dead night. I took comfort in the fact that there had been no cry of alarm from the black suit in the chamber next door, no blast of the siren. With tiny steps I pushed onward, running my hand along the wall for guidance. Every now and again I'd trip, but I managed to stay upright. Eventually the wall arced away to my left, and from the slight change in echo I knew I'd entered the cavern. There was still no light, but the air here was definitely fresher, cooler. I felt certain that it wasn't my imagination. There was something down here, some chink in Furnace's armour. I just had to get back in with a light, and I'd know for sure whether that chink was our way out. That was when I heard it. It started so quietly that I barely even noticed it. Then it began to grow in volume, a low hum like a cell phone vibrating in somebody's coat pocket. I felt my skin break out in goosebumps. I wasn't alone. There was something in here with me. The sound shifted in pitch, fading, then reasserting itself. I couldn't work out what it was, but it chilled me to the bone. I thought about the 30 kids who died in here when the cave collapsed. 30 angry spirits charging back and forth across the deserted cavern for all time, looking for somebody to take out their anger on. Maybe the hum was their collective screams, so loud and furious that it breached their ghostly plane and entered ours. I took a step back, and the noise changed again, growing louder. It toyed with my hearing, playing tricks on my tortured imagination. I couldn't tell whether it was far away or close. If distant, the noise could have been a roar, but it also could have been a whisper in my ear from something right next to me. No, not a whisper, a growl. I suddenly panicked. The noise grew louder, a guttural snarl that could only have come from one creature. It was a dog, one of the warden's monstrosities. He'd obviously put one in here to devour anyone stupid enough to try to escape. Blind and terrified, I swung around and ran, but I'd lost track of where I was, and with a crunch, I slammed into the rock wall. Something hot dripped into my mouth, choking me, and I spat out my own blood, gripping the rough stone for support. The growling was getting closer, and I saw the darkness begin to take shape, morphing into a nightmare creature that bounded towards me. I felt so sick that I thought my stomach was going to flip inside out, and I held up my hand to ward off the monster. But as soon as I did, the illusion vanished back into the night. I blinked hard, my throat slick with blood and bile. The wall had to lead back to the equipment room, so doing my best to ignore the persistent growl, I fumbled my way along it, expecting to feel dagger-like teeth sinking into my shoulder at any minute. But nothing came for me. Each time I looked back and thought I saw the beast in the blackness, it vanished with a blink of the eye, a hallucination brought on by fear and fatigue. I rounded the corner of the corridor and found myself staring at the boarded door, light squeezing through the cracks like golden fingers trying to embrace me. I took one last look into the cave, then crawled through the bottom board, staggering back into the equipment room. Too late. I realised I should have checked the room first. I heard feet pounding on rock and swiveled around in time to see a massive black shape swoop towards me. The black suit had just emerged from room 3, and like a speeding train he rammed into me, wrapping his ham-like fist around my throat and lifting me off the floor. "Better have a good explanation for this, Sawyer," he hissed. I saw the mole on his chin, knew it was the same giant who always seemed to terrorise me. His fingers were like iron, squeezing my windpipe and refusing to let me draw a breath, let alone reply. I felt my vision cloud as I stared into the twin silver portals of the freak's eyes. In them, I caught a glimpse of my own reflection. The bottom half of my face smeared with the blood that still gushed from my nose. My eyes, the very essence of terror. Seeing what I'd been reduced to was infinitely more terrifying than the man who held me. "Been fighting?" the black suit went on. And despite the pain, I felt a massive wave of relief. He hadn't seen me climb out from the tunnel. I did my best to nod, and with a glint of shark teeth, he threw me to the floor. I landed on my back, winded. "Back to work," Moleface said, pointing the gun at me. "If I see you out here again during hard labour, then I'm going to splatter you all over the walls." "Yes, sir," I said. Somehow I managed to pull myself to my feet, lifting my pickaxe from the rack again and my helmet from the floor. I barely had the strength to stagger back through to room 3, but beneath my crimson mask, I was smiling. A revelation. Tea is a revelation. Okay. The rest of the morning felt like a dream. The adrenaline had robbed my body of any sensation, leaving me completely numb, and I seemed to float back into the chipping room. As soon as Donovan saw me, he dropped his pickaxe and ran over, taking my arm and helping me to the far wall. After checking to see that the black suit hadn't followed me in, he lowered me onto the rock using his sleeve to wipe the blood from my face. I just lay there, helpless as a baby, looking at him, but not really seeing him. "Christ," he said eventually, speaking over the pounding of the pickaxes. "I won't say I told you so. What happened? Guards? Dogs?" I opened my mouth to speak, but instead of words, I suddenly found myself spewing my breakfast all over Donovan. He reeled, disgusted, but his expression quickly snapped back to one of concern. "Are you all right?" he asked. "For God's sake, don't get sick. They'll take you." "I'm okay," I slurred. Puking seemed to have removed the lead ball from my stomach, and the feeling gradually ebbed back into my body. I struggled to a sitting position and wiped the acidic drool from my lips. "Sorry about that. A little warning would have been nice," he muttered. He glanced towards the door, then back at me. "You better get up. That guard will rip your guts out if he catches you sitting down on the job." Taking a deep breath, I heaved myself upwards, using my pickaxe as a crutch. I looked at the solid wall before me, and the thought of smashing through it for the next few hours almost made me chuck again. Donovan lifted his pickaxe and brought it down hard, bathing us in sparks and debris. He struck a couple of more times, before looking at me impatiently. "Well," he said, "what did you find?" I grinned and shrugged. "I thought you weren't bothered." "I'm not, just curious is all." I started to reply, but he suddenly looked back towards the door and gently shook his head. I lifted my pickaxe, glancing out of the corner of my eye to see Moleface standing in the doorway. I couldn't make out his expression, but something told me his silver glare was aimed right at me. I took a half-hearted swing, and when I looked again, the guard had gone. "I'll tell you later, big guy," I said, swaying unsteadily as I prepared to swing again. Donovan just sniffed and muttered, "If you live that long." Showers, fresh uniforms, a march to the canteen. I could do it blindfolded now, without thinking, which is just as well because I was on autopilot for the rest of the day. I couldn't stop going over what I'd done. It didn't seem like it could have happened. None of it. The memories sat in my mind like the tendrils from some half-forgotten dream, fragments that couldn't possibly have been real. But they were. I had done it, dashed beneath the boards and entered the forbidden room, a crime that could easily have been my last. And for what? All that effort just so I could panic and flee at the slightest noise. We arrived in the trough room to see that Z was already there, positioned as far as possible from the bench occupied by the skulls and staring mournfully at his lunch. Gary Owens was sitting at the head of his table, bandana still perched on his shaven head. The other gang members sat around him like caged animals, not moving or talking, and looking like they regretted ever joining the skulls. I cast my eyes around for Kevin, but he was nowhere to be seen. Knowing this place, he was probably lying in a crypt of shadows in a dark corner somewhere, already forgotten. Scanning the room further, I made out the two other new kids, Toby and Ashley, sitting in a corner sharing food from a single plate, pressed against each other for comfort. Both their faces were bruised. Z saw us approaching and shuffled along the bench to make room. He smiled at Donovan, but did a double take when he saw me. I'd washed off all the blood in the showers, but I was guessing that my face was pretty pale. "Where'd you find Casper the Friendly Ghost?" Z asked Donovan as we sat down. "Haunting room 2, he replied softly. "No way," said Z, his eyes like pickled eggs. "You didn't." "Got busted too, the fool." Z's eyes bulged even further from his face. I thought they were going to pop. "I wasn't busted," I explained, "but it was close." "You looked like somebody had shot you in the face," Donovan said, his brow creased. I couldn't help but laugh. "Well, I kind of had myself to blame for that," I muttered, sheepishly. "I ran into a wall when I heard the growling." "Growling?" Donovan asked. But Z held up his hands and started waving. "Whoa, whoa, whoa," he said. "Start from the beginning." So I did. In hushed tones, I told them how I'd got through the wooden boards into the room, how I'd felt the blast of cold air, and how it had been pitch black, a revelation that got a laugh from both boys. I told them about the hum that I thought had been a growl. Lastly, I filled them in on my near escape from Moleface. You know, he'd probably have shot you on the spot if he'd seen you climbing out from under those boards, Donovan said when I stopped talking. I'm telling you, it's just too damn dangerous. So what was the noise? That hum? Z asked, ignoring the comment. I have no idea, I replied. I couldn't place it. I know now that it couldn't have been a dog. I mean, I'm still alive, aren't I? Something electrical, maybe, Z asked. The prison generator? Donovan shook his head. No, there's no way the generator would be through there. That room was carved from scratch by the inmates. Air vents? Z asked. Maybe it was the sound of wind in the pipes. That might be where the draft came from too. What did I just say? Said Donovan. There isn't anything in there. No wires, no pipes, no vents, nada. No, you might be right, I said to Z, trying to recall the sound in my head. What if it was wind? I mean, wind from the surface. Maybe the cave-in cracked open a rift in the rock. If fresh air is getting in, then we can get out. You're a little more substantial than thin air, Z replied. Besides, like I've said a million times, if there was a route to the surface, then don't you think they'd have sealed it off with something more secure than a few planks? I ground my teeth together, exasperated. Well, I sure as hell didn't imagine it, I hissed after a moment's silence. I heard something in that room, something big enough to make a roar or a growl or whatever. I'll figure it out. Donovan snorted and rose to go get some food. After scanning the trough room, however, he collapsed back down onto the bench. Incoming, he whispered. I glanced up to see that Gary and his henchmen were making their way across the room towards the exit to the yard. The inmates were scampering out of his way with a deference that they'd never shown towards Kevin. The former Skull Leader had been violent, yes, but there was something different about Gary. Kevin had tortured and killed to prove something, because he knew that life was valuable, something precious to take away. But Gary lashed out and killed as if life was nothing, meaningless, like he was crushing a bug. Don't look at him, Z whispered, and I lowered my eyes to the table. When I raised them again, however, I found myself staring right into Gary's face. He was standing on the other side of the table, behind Z, eyeballing me like I'd just killed his dog. I hear you've got a problem with the skulls, he said in a voice that turned my bones to water. Picking fights you got no business picking. My tongue had turned to sandpaper, my limbs to lead. Well, come on then, Gary challenged, raising his hands. His knuckles were swollen and bloody. You think you're so tough, then why don't you step up and take a crack at me? He pushed Z out of the way and leaned on the table. This close I could see a line of blonde hair on his top lip, like a tiny wig over his cracked and yellow teeth. I thought for a moment that I was going to puke again. At least I'd humiliate him before I was shanked. I swallowed hard and stared at the table. Look at me when I'm talking to you, he spat, grabbing my chin and wrenching it up. His fingers were rough against my skin. I'm telling you to come on, let's see what you've got. Not enough, I breathed. What? I'm sorry, I said, louder this time, then adding, sir, for good measure. Too late. He pushed my head back so hard that I felt something pop in my neck. Then he slammed his hand so hard, slammed his hand on the table, sending Z's food and drink flying. You're marked. You're mine. You'll get your fight, little man. And with that, he turned and pushed through the skulls, making his way towards the exit. I lowered my head and winced as pain cut through the tendons. Rubbing my neck, I saw Donovan and Z staring sheepishly at the table. Are you okay? Asked Z, not looking up. Oh yeah, that was fine, I replied, doing my best to hold back the tears that were building up behind my eyes. No problem at all. I put my elbows on the table and cupped my head in my hands so that nobody would see my glassy eyes. But I couldn't stop the floodgates from bursting. I blinked and a tear dropped from my face to the plastic surface, winding its way gently towards the other side of the table. It wasn't alone, merging with the trail of water that had spilled from Z's plastic cup. I watched the little stream meander through the piles of brown slush, flowing inexorably towards the edge. And then it hit me. A revelation so bright and wonderful that it was as if the lights in the room had doubled in strength. I sat bolt upright, so quickly that Z and Donovan both flinched. The noise! I know what it is! They looked at me as if I'd gone mad. It's water, I said, pointing at the mess on the table. It's an underground river. Yeah, maybe. We won't find out till later on, but Alex's mind is working on it. He's starting to get a plan. Okay, we'll stop there for today. Next chapter is called The Return, but I won't tell you what is returning. Some of you will know, obviously. And the next one is called A Distraction. And yeah, okay, so we are getting there. I hope you've enjoyed it. Stuck in lockdown. This is honestly one of the highlights of my day, reading this book with you all. So I'm really glad that some of you are reading along with me. Feel free, by the way, to ask any questions in the comments. I know I haven't had time to reply to all your comments yet, but I will do my best to reply. If you ask questions in the comments, I will do my best to answer them. Maybe at the beginning of the next episode. I haven't got the YouTube page open. Somebody asked me if I was going to read out all the books. I think it obviously depends on how long lockdown goes on for and how long I'm allowed to do this. But if lockdown persists, and as we've got nothing better to do, maybe I'll try and get through the whole series. That really would be something. But I can't make any promises because it all depends on lockdown. But yeah, ask any questions in the comments. Have a really lovely weekend. I know times are still tough and some of you are probably going through some pretty horrible times. But do your best to stay positive, stay safe, stay strong, and I will see you tomorrow. See you later, everyone. Bye.